Have you ever imagined that the very person you gave birth to, the person you called daughter, would be the one to kick you out of your own home without an apology? This isn't a movie. This is what happened to Clara Hale, a woman who sacrificed her youth raising a child, only to be kicked out of her home the moment that child got their hands on 48 million. But the story doesn't end there. It ends in a way the betrayer never expected. Hi, my name is Clara Hale, and I am 53 years old. I know what that means to most people. 53 is the age when you're supposed to have things figured out. A house that belongs to you, a retirement account with more than 3 digits in it, maybe a garden out back where you can sit in the late afternoon and not feel like the world is running without you. 53 is supposed to feel like arrival. Instead, I was standing on a sidewalk in the cold with a rolling suitcase and a garbage bag full of winter coats, watching the iron gate of a $7 million estate click shut behind me, like a period at the end of a sentence I never got to finish. The house I was being locked out of was a house I had helped choose. I remembered the day we drove up the Oak Line driveway for the first time. Sienna, sitting in the passenger seat, 22 years old and laughing at something on her phone, not looking up when I said, "Baby, look at this place." She'd glanced up for exactly 3 seconds, said it was nice, and gone back to scrolling. That was 8 years ago. Now it was her house, just hers. The lawyers had made that very clear. I stood there for a long time after the gate closed. I don't know exactly how long. Long enough that a delivery truck passed twice, and the driver gave me a strange look both times. The afternoon light was doing that thing it does in early autumn, where it turns everything golden and soft and beautiful, like the world is trying to apologize for something. I was not ready to accept that apology. I had not cried yet. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the crying to come immediately. The moment the gate closes, the moment the lock turns, the moment your child chooses money over you. But grief doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it just stands there with you, quiet, heavy, too big to fit into tears just yet. I picked up the handle of my suitcase and I started walking. Why? Let me tell you about the woman I used to be before I became the woman standing on that sidewalk. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, the middle child of a school librarian and a man who repaired appliances out of the garage and called it a business. We weren't poor exactly, but we understood money the way you understand a stray cat. You knew not to count on it, and you were grateful when it showed up. I was smart. Not genius smart, but the kind of smart that teachers notice and say careful things about. Clara has so much potential. That kind of smart. I got a partial scholarship to study accounting at UNC Chapel Hill, and I worked 2 jobs to cover the rest. And by the time I was 26, I had a position at a mid-sized financial firm in Charlotte and an apartment I paid for myself and a life that felt, for the first time, like something I had actually built. Then I met Randolph Mercer. I want to be careful about how I describe him, because this story isn't about him, not really, and I don't want to make him into a villain when the truth is more complicated than that. Randolph was charming in the way that certain men are charming, completely, effortlessly, like breathing. He walked into a room and the room rearranged itself around him. He had dark eyes and a laugh that started in his chest, and he had a way of making you feel like you were the only interesting person he had ever met. I was also, as I would learn over the course of 7 years, completely incapable of being faithful. But before I learned that, before I learned any of it, there was Sienna. Sienna was born on a Tuesday in March, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and the carnations Randolph had brought and forgotten to put in water. She came out furious, screaming like she had opinions about the whole situation, and I remember looking at her red, scrunched face and thinking, I am completely unprepared for this. I was right. I was completely unprepared for it, but I stayed. I stayed when Randolph started working late. I stayed when the excuses started getting creative. I stayed longer than I should have because I believed in the family I was trying to build, and because leaving felt like failure, and because Sienna was 4 and then 6 and then 8, and I didn't want her childhood to have a fracture running through it. By the time she was 10, the fracture was too big to hide. Randolph left for a woman 20 years younger and a life that had no room for school pickups or pediatrician appointments. And I was alone with a 4th grader and a mortgage and a job that paid well, but not well enough. I adjusted. That's what I did. I adjusted and I kept going because Sienna needed me to. The thing I need you to understand about Evelyn Mercer is that she was not a simple woman. She was Randolph's mother, Sienna's paternal grandmother. and she was the kind of person who occupied space differently than other people. Even in a room full of successful individuals, Evelyn had a quality of stillness that made everyone else seem slightly frantic by comparison. She had built her fortune herself, starting with a regional logistics company in the 1980s that she expanded through two recessions and a series of decisions that most people in her industry called reckless, and she called inevitable. She had been right. She was usually right. After Randolph left, I expected Evelyn to distance herself from us. That's what I was prepared for. The clean break, the polite Christmas cards that grow further apart and eventually stop. Instead, she called me on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized and said, in her direct, unhurried way, "Clara, I want you to know that none of this reflects my opinion of you. My son made a foolish choice. That is his loss to carry, not yours." I didn't know what to say to that. So I said thank you, and she said she was coming to visit Sienna on Saturday, and that was that. She came every other Saturday for the next 11 years. She taught Sienna to play chess and to read a balance sheet and to negotiate, which she demonstrated by haggling mercilessly with the produce vendor at the farmer's market, while a 12-year-old Sienna watched in fascinated horror. She was not warm in the conventional sense. She didn't do hugs easily, and she had no patience for complaining. But she was consistent, and after Randolph, consistency felt like love. She and I developed our own relationship, quietly, over those years. She would arrive on Saturday mornings with 2 cups of coffee from the good place downtown. She'd learned my order without ever asking. And we would sit at the kitchen table while Sienna slept in, and we would talk. About business, about politics, about the books we were reading. She respected my mind in a way that surprised me. She listened when I spoke. She disagreed with me directly and without cruelty, which in my experience is rarer than it should be. She was 71 when she died. The stroke came on a Tuesday morning, which seemed wrong somehow. Evelyn had always struck me as someone who would choose her exits carefully. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. The housekeeper found her in the study, still seated at her desk, which the eulogist later said was exactly how she would have wanted it, and I thought, yes, that's right, that's very her. At the reading of the will, Sienna sat beside me in a gray suit I had helped her pick out, and when the attorney read the number, $48 million, the entirety of Evelyn's estate, I felt Sienna go very still beside me. Not shocked still, something else, calculating still. I noticed it. I told myself I was wrong to notice it. I was not wrong. Well, IV. The first week after the inheritance was announced was, on the surface, triumphant. There were phone calls and flowers, and people who had never shown any particular interest in Sienna's life suddenly showing a great deal of it. Her phone rang constantly. She was invited to dinners and events I had never heard of. A woman named Portia, who had gone to school with Sienna and barely spoken to her since, called 3 times in a single afternoon, and by the third call was using the word bestie. I watched all of this from what felt like an increasing distance. I want to be fair. In those first days, Sienna was still her. Still the girl who texted me when something funny happened, who called me on her way home from things, who needed my opinion on decisions even when she'd already made them. There were moments in those first days where I thought, we're going to be okay. This money doesn't have to change anything. We can figure out how to carry this together. I should have paid more attention to the moments when she was on the phone with the new people and I walked into the room and she turned slightly away from me. Small thing, barely noticeable, but I noticed it. The attorney's name was Garrett Blake. He arrived at the estate on the 5th day with a leather portfolio and a smile that was doing too much work. And he sat across from Sienna at the dining room table and spent 3 hours explaining what he described as opportunities, investment structures, trust configurations, tax strategies. I was present for the first 40 minutes of this meeting before Sienna looked at me and said, in a carefully pleasant voice, "Mom, you don't need to be here for all of this. It's really technical." I blinked. "I worked in finance for 20 years, Sienna. I know. I think I've got it." Garrett Blake did not look at me. He was studying his portfolio with great interest. I stood up and I left the room, and I stood in the hallway for a moment outside the door, and through the wood I heard Sienna say something, and then both of them laughed, and I thought, okay, she's 30 years old, she's allowed to handle her own business affairs. I went to make tea. I made it in the kitchen of a house I had lived in for 4 years, a house I had helped Sienna find before the inheritance. Before any of this, back when she was a mid-level marketing coordinator and the rent here was a stretch, and she needed a co-signer on the lease. I had co-signed. I had moved in at her request. When the lease converted to a purchase, she couldn't quite manage alone. I made my tea, and I told myself I wasn't frightened. V. Her name was Portia Langford, and I want to give you an accurate picture of her because she will matter later. Portia was 32, impeccably dressed in the way that looks effortless but costs more than most people's car payments. And she had the quality that I have since come to recognize as a particular kind of social intelligence. Not warmth, but the convincing imitation of it. She could make you feel, within the first 3 minutes of meeting her, that she had been hoping to run into you specifically, that she found you genuinely delightful, and that whatever you were saying was the most interesting thing she'd heard all week. It was a talent. I'll give her that. She began appearing at the house on the 6th day, and by the 10th, she was there every afternoon. She and Sienna would sit in the sunroom with wine and laptops and speak in the abbreviated, reference-heavy shorthand of people who have decided they are in the same club. The Harcastle dinner, the Meridian thing, what Marcus was saying about the Fontaine deal. I did not know who Marcus was. I did not know what the Meridian thing was. The first time I made the mistake of asking, Portia gave me a smile so polished it functioned as a wall and said, "Oh, it's just some investment group thing. Pretty boring, honestly." And then she turned back to Sienna and continued as if I had not spoken. Sienna did not look at me. That was the moment I began to understand that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a room shifts when someone quietly moves the furniture 3 inches. Nothing obvious, but suddenly everything feels slightly wrong, and you can't immediately identify why. I tried to talk to Sienna about it that evening, after Portia had left. I found her in the kitchen, scrolling through something on her phone, still wearing that particular expression she'd been wearing all week. Distracted, slightly impatient, like she had somewhere more important to be inside her own head. "Hey," I said. "Can we talk?" "Sure, what's up?" I just, I want to make sure we're staying connected through all of this. It's a big change. I want to be here for you." She looked up from her phone, and for a moment I saw something flash across her face. Guilt, maybe, or something adjacent to it. Then it was gone. "Mom, I'm fine. It's just busy right now." "I know. I'm not saying you're not fine. I'm just saying I'm here." "I know you're here." She said it in the tone that means, "You've said what you wanted to say, so we're done now." Then she looked back at her phone. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of the house around me, and I thought about a version of this conversation that went differently. One where she put the phone down, one where she said, "Actually, can we sit? I want to talk too." That version of the conversation did not happen. Say. The morning of the 14th day after the will was read, I woke up to the sound of voices downstairs. It was early, just past 7, and I came downstairs in my robe to find Sienna already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with Garrett Blake and a woman I didn't recognize, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and a briefcase that looked expensive. They had coffee. They had papers. They had the particular energy of people who had already been talking for a while. "Oh, Mom." Sienna's voice landed the way a foot lands on a step you thought was there but wasn't. Surprised, slightly disrupted. "Good morning," I said. We're in the middle of something." The woman with the briefcase was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Garrett Blake was looking at the papers. "Should I come back?" I asked, even though this was my home and I should not have had to ask. "Actually, yes. If you don't mind, maybe give us an hour?" I went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in my robe, and I looked at the carpet, and I did the thing I almost never do. I counted backwards from 100. It's a technique my therapist taught me years ago, when Randolph left, when the floor felt like it was tilting. 100, 99, 98. At 63, I heard the front door open and close. New voices, more than one. I didn't go back downstairs until 10:15. By then, the kitchen was empty. Sienna was in the sunroom with the door pulled mostly shut, and the briefcase woman was gone, and there was a yellow legal pad on the kitchen table with handwriting. I didn't recognize that said, near the top of the page, transition timeline. I did not pick up the legal pad. I should have picked up the legal pad. "Mom, Ken," she told me on a Thursday. I remember the day clearly, because it had been raining since morning, the kind of steady, quiet rain that makes everything feel muffled. And I had been working on a crossword puzzle at the kitchen table because I had always found crossword puzzles calming, and there was something almost funny about the fact that I was sitting there with a crossword puzzle when the ground fell out from underneath me. Sienna came in and sat across from me. She was dressed formally, blazer, hair done, which later struck me as a detail worth noting. She had dressed for this. She had prepared for it. "I want to talk to you about the house," she said. "Okay," I said. "I've been thinking a lot about the next chapter, what I want this space to be, and I've made a decision about the living situation." The living situation, that's what she called it. "I think it's time for us to have our own separate spaces, for both of us. I think we've been in each other's lives in a way that I think it would be healthier going forward for each of us to have more independence." I put my pen down. "Sienna, I've already had someone look at some apartments in Midtown. There are some really nice ones. I can help with the deposit. You're asking me to move out. I'm saying I think it would be better of this house. The house I co-signed. The house I moved into when you needed me to. You're asking me to leave." She looked at the table. "The property transfer is being finalized. It'll be officially just in my name, so technically. I heard the word come out of my mouth in a way that surprised even me. Flat. Hard. Like something dropped on concrete. "Mom, I need to understand what's happening right now. Because 2 weeks ago, we were a family. 2 weeks ago, you called me from the grocery store to ask whether to get the regular pasta or the whole wheat. 2 weeks ago, I was a person in your life, and now I'm a living situation. I'm not trying to—" "What are you trying to do, Sienna? Walk me through it. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you got $48 million, and the first thing you did was decide you didn't need me anymore." The silence that followed was long enough to have a shape. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, but there was a quality underneath the quiet that I hadn't heard before. Something new. Something that didn't belong to the daughter I'd raised. "I think you've always needed to be needed," she said. "I think you made yourself essential on purpose because that's how you stayed relevant, and I don't think that's healthy for either of us. I will tell you the truth. Those words hit me somewhere that bruises don't show." I had heard variations of this argument before, in other contexts, from women I knew whose adult children had started therapy and returned with new vocabularies for old grievances. I understood the framework. I understood the language. I even understood, intellectually, that there can be truth in the idea that loving too intensely can be its own kind of weight on someone. But I also knew that the person sitting across from me was not saying these things because she had done the slow, difficult work of examining our relationship. She was saying these things because someone had handed her a script, and the script made her feel sophisticated instead of cruel, and she preferred that version of herself. "Who told you to say that?" I asked quietly. Her jaw tightened. "Excuse me? That specific thing. You made yourself essential on purpose. Did Portia say that? Did Garrett Blake? Because it doesn't sound like you, Sienna. You've never talked about our relationship that way in 30 years. Maybe that's because I finally have the freedom to— the freedom." I stood up slowly. I picked up my crossword puzzle and my pen. "Let me ask you something. When your father left, when you were 10 years old and you stopped sleeping and you started pulling out your hair, not enough that anyone could see, but enough that I could see, where was your freedom then? When I sat outside your door at 2 in the morning because you wouldn't let me in, but I wanted you to hear that someone was there, where was I making myself essential? Tell me, because I want to understand the version of history you've constructed, where all of that was manipulation." Bamampe. She didn't answer. I walked out of the kitchen. I went upstairs. I closed my door without slamming it, which cost me more than anything else I did that day. Sam, eat. I packed in 2 hours. Not everything. There wasn't room for everything. I took my clothes, my books, the quilt my mother had made, the photographs that were mine and not ours, the small wooden box where I kept the things I couldn't lose, my passport, my social security card, 3 letters from people who were gone now. I left the furniture because it wasn't worth fighting over. I left the kitchen equipment because it would only remind me. I left a plant on the windowsill that I'd had for 9 years, a pothos that had survived 3 apartments and the general chaos of my life. And leaving that plant felt, I will be honest with you, like the hardest part. Sienna was downstairs when I brought my bags to the door. She was sitting in the living room with her phone, and she looked up when she heard me, and for a moment, Just a moment. Something crossed her face that might have been uncertainty. You don't have to do it today, she said. I didn't mean. No, I said. I think we should finish what we started. Mom, I'm not angry. This was half true. I want you to be happy. I genuinely want that. But I need you to know something, and I need you to really hear it, even if it takes a long time for it to land. She was quiet. I don't know the people advising you right now. I don't know their names or their histories or what they want from you. But I know this. People who care about you don't ask you to throw away the people who were there before the money. People who are for you don't need you to be alone to work their way in. That's not love, baby. That's strategy. She looked away. Her jaw was set. I picked up my bags. The gate clicked shut behind me. The delivery truck passed. The afternoon light did its apologetic golden thing, and I stood there on the sidewalk, 53 years old, with a rolling suitcase and a garbage bag full of winter coats. And I thought about the pothos on the windowsill, and about the 10-year-old who used to sit outside her bedroom door in the dark, and about all the crossword puzzles I would do in a different kitchen now. I thought about Evelyn Mercer, who had built a $48 million empire and then left every cent of it to a 30-year-old who had just learned that freedom means getting rid of the people who love you. And I thought, Evelyn, I hope you knew what you were doing, because I'm not sure I do right now. I started walking. I didn't look back. Not because I wasn't afraid, because sometimes the only way to survive the things that break you is to keep moving until you find out whether or not they actually can. My sister Diane lived 40 minutes outside the city in a house that smelled like dryer sheets and the particular brand of cinnamon candle she had burned in every home she'd ever lived in since 1987. She was 58, divorced twice, and had the quality of a person who had survived enough of her own disasters to stop being surprised by other people's. When I called her from the sidewalk outside the estate, still standing there with my suitcase, the golden light fading now into something grayer and colder, she answered on the second ring and said, before I could get 3 words out, how long do you need the room? I almost came apart right there. I don't know, I said. My voice was doing something embarrassing. Okay, room's yours. Come now or come later, doesn't matter. I've got leftover soup. That was Diane. No theater, no performance, no long intake of breath followed by, I can't believe she did that. Just, come now or come later. I've got soup. I had spent 30 years wishing Diane and I lived closer, and in that moment 40 minutes felt like exactly the right distance from the worst day of my adult life. I called a ride share because I could not manage the bus with a rolling suitcase and a garbage bag and whatever was happening to my chest, which felt tight in a way that scared me a little. The driver was a young man who asked if I was going to the airport, and I said no, just visiting family. And he nodded and put on something low and instrumental and left me alone, which was exactly what I needed him to do. I watched the city pass through the window, the restaurants and the storefronts, and the people on sidewalks, with their ordinary Friday afternoon lives. And I thought about the last time I had felt this particular kind of displacement. It was after Randolph left. Same sensation. The world continuing at its normal pace while something inside you had stopped, completely stopped, and you were trying to figure out how to move your body through space when the person who was supposed to be there wasn't anymore. Only this time it was worse, because Randolph leaving was a thing I had, on some level, seen coming. I had felt the loosening of it for years before it finally unraveled. This, Sienna, this had been a wall. And then it wasn't, and I hadn't felt the wall weaken. I had walked into it at full speed. Diane's soup was chicken and rice, slightly oversalted, which was how she always made it, and I ate 2 bowls at her kitchen table while she sat across from me with her tea and asked questions in the careful, non-pushy way of someone who understands that the person in front of them is managing a structural failure and might need a little time before they can describe the blueprints. How much warning did she give you? Diane asked after a while. She told me Thursday. I left Thursday. Diane's expression didn't change, but I saw something move through her eyes. Same day. I didn't see this point in extending it. No, she said. I don't suppose you did. She refilled my soup without asking. Are you sleeping? I haven't tried yet today. You need to sleep. I know, Diane. I'm not nagging. I'm just, you go gray when you don't sleep. You've always gone gray. I looked at her across the table. This woman I had grown up fighting with and then, somewhere in our 30s, had quietly become the person I trusted most in the world. And I thought, How is it possible that the daughter I raised doesn't know me the way this woman knows me? How do you spend 30 years with someone and end up a stranger? I didn't say any of that. I ate my soup. I slept 9 hours that night, which surprised me, and woke up to the sound of Diane's ancient coffee maker running through its cycle and the smell of something burnt, which turned out to be the toast she had forgotten to watch. And I sat at her kitchen table in the thin morning light and tried to take an inventory of my life. Here is what I had: a rolling suitcase, a garbage bag of winter coats, approximately $18,000 in a personal savings account that had been earmarked for a trip to Portugal I would now not be taking, a cell phone with a cracked corner that I had been meaning to fix for 4 months, and a sister with a spare room that smelled like cinnamon candles. Here's what I did not have: a plan. I had not been without a plan in 30 years. Even in the worst moments, Randolph leaving, the lease renewals that scared me, the months when Sienna's tuition and my own bills created a math problem with no clean solution, I had always had a plan. A list. A series of steps. I was a woman who made plans the way other people breathe, automatically and without thinking about it. Sitting in Diane's kitchen with my burnt toast, I could not see the next step. I could barely see the next hour. That frightened me more than the suitcase, more than the garbage bag, more than the gate clicking shut. I picked up my phone. I did not call Sienna. I thought about it. I'm going to be honest, because this whole thing is about being honest. I thought about it for approximately 10 seconds, and there was a version of me that wanted to call and say something that would make her understand, really understand, what she had done. Something surgical. Something that would land and leave a mark. I put the phone down. That impulse, to wound back, to make her feel what she'd caused. That's the most human part of this whole story. And I want you to sit with it for a second, because I think a lot of people tell versions of this story where the wronged party is perfectly measured and dignified from the moment the gate closes. That's not real. That's not how it works. The truth is that I wanted her to hurt. I wanted her to understand. And I had to make a deliberate, effortful choice not to act on that. And it cost me something. And it kept costing me every day for weeks. Instead of calling Sienna, I called the one person whose advice I had always trusted above almost anyone else's in matters of money and strategy. His name was Franklin Webb, and he had been Evelyn Mercer's personal attorney for 16 years before he retired the previous spring. I had his number because Evelyn had given it to me herself, one Saturday morning over coffee, in the way she gave things, directly, without ceremony, as if it were obvious. Franklin handles things correctly, she had said. If you ever need someone who handles things correctly, you call Franklin. He answered on the fourth ring, slightly out of breath, and I could hear what sounded like a lawnmower in the background. Clara Hale, he said. It's been some time. I'm sorry to call on a Saturday, I said. Don't be. What's happened? I told him. Not everything. Not the crossword puzzle, and the rain, and the words Sienna had said about me making myself essential on purpose, but the material facts. The will, the estate, the attorney named Garrett Blake, the transition timeline on the yellow legal pad, the gate. There was a silence on his end. The lawnmower seemed to stop. Garrett Blake, he said. You know him? I know of him. His voice had changed. Not dramatically, but in the way a room changes when someone turns off one of the lights. He ran a financial advisory practice out of Decatur for about 6 years. There were some complaints. Nothing that went anywhere legally, but complaints. What kind of complaints? The kind that tend to follow a certain type of advisor. Clients who came in with significant assets and came out with significantly less. Elderly clients, mostly. Inheritance situations. He paused. How much contact has he had with Sienna? The chill started in my hands and moved up my arms. Almost daily, I said, since the will was read. Another pause, longer this time. Clara, where are you right now? My sister's house. Good. Stay somewhere stable. Don't contact Sienna yet. Not about any of this. Let me make some calls first. Can you do that? Yes, I said. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Evelyn would be furious, he said quietly. And I'm thinking we need to move carefully. He said he would call me by Monday. We hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand and looked at the wall of Diane's kitchen. The little framed cross-stitch that said, "Home is where the soup is," which Diane's first daughter had made in middle school. And I thought about Garrett Blake and his leather portfolio and his smile that was working too hard, and about the woman with the briefcase who had been in my kitchen at 7 in the morning. I thought about Sienna saying, "It's really technical." I thought about the way Garrett Blake had not looked at me. The soup sat heavy in my stomach now. Not because of the salt, because I had walked out of that house with my dignity intact and my rage swallowed, and it had felt like the right thing to do, and I still believed it was the right thing to do. But I was beginning to understand that it had also meant leaving someone I loved alone in a room with people I did not trust, and that the cost of my dignity might be something I hadn't yet calculated. The week that followed was the strangest of my life, and that's including the week Randolph left, the week my mother died, the week I had a health scare that turned out to be nothing but felt like everything until it didn't. I fell into a routine at Diane's because routine is how I survive things. I woke early, made coffee, sat with Diane's cat, a large indifferent orange tabby named Senator, who had no opinions about my situation and was therefore restful company. I updated my resume, which felt absurd and also necessary. I walked. I walked a lot. Around Diane's neighborhood, past the houses with their tidy yards and their basketball hoops and their Halloween decorations that someone had not yet taken down. And I walked until the tightness in my chest loosened enough that I could breathe fully again. I did not hear from Sienna. I checked my phone more than I would like to admit. Not because I was waiting for an apology. I had given up the fantasy of that fairly quickly. But because there's a thing that happens when someone who has been central to your life disappears. Your nervous system keeps looking for them, keeps generating the impulse to reach. Like a tooth that's been pulled, your tongue keeps finding the gap. On Sunday evening, 3 days after I'd left the estate, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Clara, this is Portia Langford. I think we got off on the wrong foot. I'd like to have coffee and clear the air. I can come to wherever you are." I stared at that text for a long time. Then I put the phone face down on Diane's coffee table and went to make more tea. Diane, who had been watching me from the doorway with the expression of a woman who had lived enough to recognize a trap when it walked up and knocked, said, "What did it say?" "Portia wants to have coffee, to clear the air." Diane made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "What air does she think needs clearing?" "I have no idea." "What are you going to do?" I thought about it. I thought about what Franklin had said. Don't contact Sienna yet, and about the way Portia's presence had shifted Sienna's behavior, and about the fact that someone who is genuinely interested in clearing the air generally doesn't wait 5 days to reach out, and generally doesn't reach out through a channel that bypasses the person at the center of the situation. "Nothing," I said. "I'm not going to respond." "Good, good," Diane said. She went back to her book. I did not respond. Portia did not follow up. The silence from that direction, which I had half expected to be temporary, stretched into something that felt deliberate, and I filed it alongside everything else I was collecting in the part of my mind that was quietly, carefully paying attention. Franklin called on Monday morning, as promised. I was sitting in the spare room with Senator on my feet, and my laptop open to a job listing. I was only half-heartedly reading, and when I saw his name on the screen, I answered immediately. "I've made some inquiries," he said. "I want you to listen carefully, and I want you to understand that some of this is still preliminary. But Clara, there are things happening with that estate that concern me." "Tell me." "Blake has connected Sienna with a firm called Meridian Capital Advisors. I assume you've heard that name. The sunroom, Portia and Sienna, the Meridian thing." "I've heard it mentioned. Meridian is not registered with the SEC. They operate through a web of offshore structures that make them extremely difficult to trace. They present themselves as a boutique investment group, exclusive, invitation only, the kind of positioning that makes wealthy young inheritors feel chosen. But the financial structures they use are, Clara, they're designed to move money, not grow it, move it." I gripped the phone. Senator shifted on my feet, unbothered. "How much has Sienna committed?" I don't know yet. I have someone trying to find out. But if she's signed anything with Blake as the intermediary, it could be significant. The signing bonuses they use to lock in initial commitments are, it's sophisticated. It's designed to look legitimate until the moment it isn't. I stood up. Senator protested and relocated. "Franklin, she could lose everything." "Yes." "Does she know? Does she have any idea what she's—" "That's the question, isn't it?" His voice was careful. whether she's been deceived or whether she's been complicit or whether, and I say this not to wound you, whether she's simply made a series of decisions that she will come to regret very badly. I sat back down on the edge of the bed. The room was very quiet except for Senator, who was now washing his face in the corner with the thoroughness of someone who has no mortgage and no problems. What do we do? I asked. We document, we wait, we build a picture before we move. If we push now and she pushes back, we lose any chance of catching this before it goes too far. A pause. And Clara, you can't be the one to approach her about this. Not yet. If she hears this from you, she'll read it as interference, as exactly what they've told her you are. What have they told her I am? The pause was a beat too long. Someone who wants access to her money. Someone who made herself useful in order to secure her position. The words landed the same way Sienna's had, in the kitchen, over the crossword puzzle. That same bruise that doesn't show location. They've been building this, I said quietly. Not a question. Yes, I think they started before Evelyn was even gone. The timeline of Blake's introduction, how quickly he appeared after the will was filed. It's not accidental. I thought about Garrett Blake appearing on the 5th day. I thought about the morning meeting at 7, the early coffee, the early papers. I thought about a woman with a briefcase and reading glasses and the words transition timeline written on a yellow legal pad. I thought about Sienna's face across the kitchen table, delivering words in a voice that wasn't quite hers. And I felt something shift inside me. Something that had been pure grief, or close to it, developing a spine. Franklin, I said, what do you need from me? Right now, keep a record. Write down everything you remember, dates, names, conversations, anything unusual you observed in those 2 weeks. Be specific. Be accurate. Don't editorialize. I worked in finance for 20 years. I know how to document. I know you do. And I could hear, just barely, something like relief in his voice. Not surprise. Relief. That's why I'm telling you all of this. We hung up, and I opened a new document on my laptop, and at the top of the page I typed a date, and then I started writing. I wrote for 3 hours. I wrote about the morning meetings and the closed-door conversations and the name Meridian surfacing in the sunroom. I wrote about the legal pad and the transition timeline and Portia's smile that functioned as a wall. I wrote about the attorney with the leather portfolio who had not looked at me when Sienna told me to leave the room. I wrote carefully. I wrote clearly. I wrote the way Evelyn had taught me to think, without sentiment, without assumption, just facts in their correct order. And somewhere in the second hour of writing, when I was describing the moment I heard Sienna laugh with Garrett Blake through the closed dining room door, something occurred to me. Something that made me stop typing and sit very still. Evelyn Mercer had been meticulous about her estate planning. I had watched her, over 11 years, approach every significant decision with the same thorough deliberateness she brought to everything else. She had updated her will twice in the final 3 years of her life. She had met with Franklin multiple times. She had structured everything carefully. She had left everything to Sienna, yes. But Evelyn Mercer had not left me nothing. She had given me Franklin Webb's phone number, directly. On a Saturday morning, over coffee, without ceremony. If you ever need someone who handles things correctly, you call Franklin. She had not said, if Sienna ever needs someone. She had said, if you ever need someone. I sat with that for a long time. Outside Diane's window, November was doing its work, stripping the last of the color from the trees, turning everything to that particular gray and brown palette that felt, in other years, merely like the end of fall, and felt now like a landscape that matched something interior. But I was sitting at a desk. I had a document open. I had 17 pages of careful notes, and a retired attorney who was making phone calls on my behalf. And I had the number he'd given me because a 71-year-old woman with dark eyes and perfect stillness had decided on a Saturday morning that I was worth protecting. That was not nothing at all. I saved the document. I closed the laptop. I went downstairs and found Diane watching something on television, and I sat beside her on the couch, and Senator climbed immediately onto my lap with the confidence of a cat who has decided you belong to him now. And I thought, okay. You are 53 years old and you have been through worse than this. You know how to survive things. You know how to wait. And whatever is happening inside that mansion right now, whatever Garrett Blake and Portia Langford and Meridian Capital and all the rest of them are doing with the $48 million that was supposed to go to the daughter you raised, It is not going to end the way they think it is. I didn't know yet how I knew that. I just knew it the same way, in the middle of a bad storm, that it is still weather and not the end of the world, Senator purred. Diane laughed at something on TV. The cinnamon candle burned in the corner. I was still here, and I was paying attention. The call came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after I had walked out of the estate with my rolling suitcase and my garbage bag of winter coats. And it came from a number I recognized immediately because it was the number I had not allowed myself to call. My thumb hovered over the screen for 4 full rings. I answered, "Mom," just that word, just that one syllable, and something in her voice told me everything I needed to know before she said another thing. It was a quality I hadn't heard in years, not since she was a teenager, not since the hard years after Randolph left. A particular kind of stripped-down sound, like whatever coating she'd been applying to herself for the past 3 weeks had been removed, and what was underneath was younger and smaller and frightened. "Sienna, I need—" She stopped. I heard her breathe. Something happened. I sat very still on the edge of the spare bed, Senator materializing from somewhere and positioning himself against my leg. With the instinct animals seem to have for the moments when you need weight against you. What happened? Marcus is gone. I didn't know who Marcus was. I had heard the name in passing, through sunroom doors and fragments of conversation I wasn't meant to overhear. But I didn't ask for clarification yet because the word gone was doing work in her sentence, and I needed to understand what kind. "Gone how?" I asked. She made a sound that might have been a laugh in another context. "Gone as in gone." Phone disconnected. Office emptied. His assistant called me yesterday morning to tell me he'd resigned effective immediately and left the country. And the money— Her voice cracked on the last word just slightly, like a hairline fracture. "The first transfer, the one I authorized 3 weeks ago. It went through his firm, and now the firm is—" "How much?" I asked. My voice was very calm. This is the thing about panic. It had its window, and it closed it. What comes after is just math, and I had always been good at math. The number she told me was $11 million. I had been expecting something bad. I had not been expecting 11 million. I did not say anything immediately. I needed a moment to absorb that number without letting the absorption show in my voice. Because Sienna needed someone steady right now, and whatever I was feeling personally. And I was feeling things, multiple things simultaneously, some of them not charitable. None of that was going to help her. "Okay," I said. "Okay?" Her voice went up at the end. "Mom, I just told you. I know what you told me. I said okay because I needed a second. Are you at the house?" "Yes." "Is anyone with you?" A pause. "Portia was here this morning, but she left. She said she had an appointment." Of course she did. Of course, the moment the structure began to crack, Portia Langford had an appointment. "Garrett Blake?" "He's not answering his phone." I closed my eyes briefly. When I opened them, the room looked the same as it had 30 seconds ago. The cinnamon candle smell, the gray November light through Diane's curtains, Senator watching me with his flat orange judgment. But I had moved into different territory inside myself. The territory where you stop processing and start acting, because processing is a luxury and there isn't time for it. "I need you to not touch anything," I said. "No financial accounts, no transfers, no responding to any emails or calls from anyone connected to Marcus or Meridian or Garrett Blake. Nothing. Can you do that?" "Yes, but I'm going to make a call. I'll be back to you within the hour." "Mom," she said it differently this time, not the stripped-down, frightened way, but something quieter. "I'm sorry. I know I don't have the right to call you after what I—" "Sienna." I stopped her there. Not gently, exactly. Gently wasn't what either of us needed, but firmly. "We'll talk about all of that. We'll talk about everything, but not right now. Right now I need you to sit still and not do anything until I call you back." "Okay." "Lock the front door." "What?" "Lock the front door and don't let anyone in. Not Portia, not Garrett Blake, not anyone you don't already trust. Do you understand?" A long silence. Then, "Yes." We hung up. I sat for exactly 30 seconds, letting the whole picture assemble in my mind. The pieces Franklin had given me, the pieces Sienna had just added, the shape they made together. Then I called Franklin. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. "It started," I said. "Marcus Vale? You already know. I got a notification this morning. His firm, the shell company through which Meridian was operating in this state, filed dissolution papers yesterday afternoon. It's a clean exit on paper. In practice, it's a theft of significant proportions. 11 million, I said. That's what Sienna said. A pause. That matches what I was afraid it might be. The initial commitment structure they use is designed to extract the largest possible sum in the first transfer before they run, I said. Yes. I stood up. I started moving around the spare room the way I do when I need to think. Not pacing exactly, more like the body requiring motion as a kind of supplement for the mind. Where does this leave the rest of the estate? She said 48 million. 11 is gone. What about the rest? That's what concerns me most right now. Meridian's involvement wasn't limited to Marcus Vale. Garrett Blake has been the architect here. Vale was one instrument, but not the only one. I have reason to believe there are additional structures in place. Contracts. Sienna may have signed with parties she doesn't fully understand. If Blake disappears the same way Vale did, he's already not answering his phone, I said. A silence that contained a great deal. Clara, you need to get to that house. I know. And you need to bring someone. Not a friend. Someone with standing. Can you come? I can be there in 2 hours. I'm calling a colleague on the way, a fraud attorney who's handled situations like this before. Her name is Josephine Park. She's very good. All right. Don't speak to Blake if he surfaces. Not without me present. And Clara, he paused. I know this isn't the way you wanted to go back there. I looked at the rolling suitcase in the corner of Diane's spare room, the garbage bag of winter coats that I had not fully unpacked because unpacking felt too permanent. No, I said, it isn't. I'll see you in 2 hours. I found Diane in the kitchen and told her what was happening with the economy of someone who doesn't have time for the full version. She listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of love, and when I was done, she said, Do you want me to come? No. Stay here. I might need somewhere to come back to tonight. You always have somewhere to come back to, she said. She said it simply, without making it into a thing, and I grabbed my coat and my bag and left before I could think too hard about the fact that I was about to walk back through a gate that had clicked shut behind me 23 days ago. The rideshare felt shorter this time. The city looked different, colder, more direct, stripped of its autumn softness. When we turned onto the Oak Line Drive, I felt something move through me that wasn't quite dread, and wasn't quite resolve, but lived somewhere between the two. The driver dropped me at the gate, and I buzzed the intercom, and Sienna's voice came through immediately, like she had been standing next to it. The gate opened. She met me at the front door, and the first thing I noticed was how different she looked. 3 weeks had done something to her. Not aged her exactly, but removed something. The particular shine that wealth and excitement produce on a person, that surface brightness that had been there when I'd left. It was gone. She looked like herself, which was to say, she looked younger and less certain, and somehow both worse and better than the version of her I had last seen. She looked like my daughter. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The doorway held us both, her inside it and me on the threshold, and I thought about how many times I had stood in this same spot, coming home from work, bringing groceries, that one night during a thunderstorm. When I'd been on the porch and the power went out, and she'd opened the door with a flashlight and laughed at my expression. All those times the doorway had been ordinary. All those times I had crossed it without thinking. She stepped back. I came inside. The house looked different in the specific way that houses look when they've been filled with the wrong people. Not dirty. It was meticulously clean in the way that professional cleaning services produce. The surfaces perfect, and the proportions slightly wrong. There were things in it that hadn't been there before. A massive abstract canvas on the wall of the living room, a bar cart in the corner with bottles I didn't recognize, flowers in a vase that had gone 2 days past fresh. Tell me everything, I said. Not the version you've been telling yourself, everything. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had delivered those words about me making myself essential on purpose, where I had put down my crossword puzzle pen, and she told me. It came out in pieces, the way confessions always do. Not in order, not cleanly, but in the circling, backtracking, reapproaching way of someone who has been sitting alone with something too large for too long and is only now letting it out into a room where it has to take shape. Marcus Vale had arrived in her life through Portia, as I had suspected. Portia had described him as a genius. Those were the words she used, apparently multiple times. A financial genius who worked exclusively with high net worth clients, and who, by the way, didn't take just anyone. The exclusivity had been deliberate and effective. Sienna had felt, in her words, chosen. The words sat on the table between us like something that needed to be looked at directly. I was so... She stopped, started again. He wasn't what I expected. He was calm, careful. He showed me projections, Clara, actual detailed projections with historical data. And Garrett had explained all the structures beforehand so that when Marcus presented it, it made sense. It made sense. It was designed to make sense, I said. Not harshly, just factually. I know that now. What did you sign? She got up and went to the desk in the study, Evelyn's old desk, which Sienna had kept because it was beautiful, and because even in the middle of all of this, she still had some connection to the grandmother who had given it to her, and came back with a folder. She put it on the table. I opened it. I spent 15 minutes going through the documents. Some of what I saw made my stomach tighten, and some of what I saw made me genuinely furious, and all of it made me extraordinarily glad that Franklin was on his way with Josephine Park, because what Sienna had signed was not a straightforward investment agreement. It was a layered, complex set of instruments designed to look like a standard fund commitment, while containing language that transferred discretionary control of significant portions of the estate to entities that were not Sienna and could not be easily traced or held accountable. This was not amateur work. This had been built by someone who had done it before. Sienna. I set the folder down. How much of this did Garrett Blake explain to you before you signed? He walked me through it. Did he go through the specific clauses? The discretionary control sections on pages 11 through 14. She looked uncertain. He said those were standard. They are not standard. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed, and the sound of it made both of us look at the window briefly, reflexively, and I thought, we are both frightened right now, in different ways, about different things, and that is the most we have had in common in a month. Clara, her voice was low. How bad is it? I don't know yet. It depends on things I can't fully assess without help, but I've already called Franklin Webb, and he's bringing a fraud attorney. Her eyes widened slightly. Evelyn's Franklin? Yes. You called him? I called him 3 weeks ago, I said, and let that sit. The silence that followed was not comfortable. There was something working in her face. Reading it, I could see her processing the implications of what I'd just said. That I had known, or suspected, early enough to call Franklin. That I had been preparing while she was celebrating. That the woman she had accused of making herself essential on purpose had, in fact, been moving quietly in the background doing the things she had always done. Trying to protect someone who didn't want to be protected by her. You knew, she said. I was afraid, I corrected. There's a difference. I didn't know what I was afraid of. I just knew the people around you made me afraid. Why didn't you... She stopped herself because she heard the question she was about to ask and understood why it was not one she had the standing to ask right now. Because you told me to leave, I said anyway, quietly. Because you were very clear about the fact that you didn't need me or want my perspective. And because pushing past that, even when I was afraid, would have been exactly what you accused me of doing, so I left, and I worked from the outside. She put her face in her hands. Not crying. Not yet. But the gesture of someone who is holding something that's gotten very heavy. I said terrible things to you, she said into her palms. Yes. I believed them when I said them. I know. Portia. She took her hands away from her face. Her eyes were bright. She kept saying things about you. About mothers who can't let go. About women who need their children to stay small so they can stay relevant. She made it sound like what I was feeling was insight. Like I had finally figured something out. Someone gave her that framework, I said. And she gave it to you. And it worked because you were 30 years old and you had just come into more money than either of us has ever seen, and you wanted to feel powerful. You wanted to feel like you had made yourself, not like you were someone who had been made by circumstances and other people's sacrifices. She flinched. I understand that, I continued. I'm not saying it to wound you. I'm saying it because I think you need someone to say it out loud so you can stop carrying it as a secret. I was so stupid. You were targeted, I said, by professionals. That's different from stupid. She looked at me for a long moment. Are you defending me right now? I'm being accurate, I said. You were also cruel. Both things are true at the same time. She didn't look away. That was something. 3 weeks ago, she would have looked away. Franklin arrived at 1:15 with Josephine Park, who was about 45, small and precise in a dark blazer, and the particular manner of someone who has spent years in rooms where large amounts of money were disappearing and has developed an immunity to being surprised by it. She shook my hand, shook Sienna's hand, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the folder I had assembled without preamble. She read for 20 minutes without speaking. Franklin sat beside her and drank the coffee Sienna made, badly. She had never been good at coffee. And I sat across from them and watched Josephine Park's face for information, because people who work in complex financial fraud cannot entirely hide their reactions to what they're reading, even when they're practiced at it. What I saw in her face during those 20 minutes was not encouraging. When she finally looked up, she directed herself to Sienna. Ms. Mercer, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them as completely and accurately as possible, even if the answers make you uncomfortable. Can you do that? Sienna glanced at me. I nodded slightly. Yes, she said. How many documents in total have you signed since the estate was transferred to you? I'm not sure exactly. A lot. There were things almost every day for the first 2 weeks. Do you have copies of all of them? I thought I did. Blake said he would keep the files. Josephine Park looked at Franklin. Franklin looked at his coffee. Blake has been unreachable since yesterday, I said. Yes. Josephine closed the folder and opened her briefcase. I want to be straightforward with you both, because I think that's more useful than softening this. The documents you've shown me represent a significant problem, but they're also, and I want you to hear this part, not unsolvable. Financial fraud involving signed instruments is recoverable in ways that simpler theft is not, precisely because it leaves a paper trail. The question is whether we can move quickly enough to freeze assets before they're fully dispersed, and whether the instruments themselves contain enough technical irregularities to form a basis for reversal. Do they? I asked. She looked at me with an expression that was as close to a smile as she probably got in professional settings. Several of these clauses are, in my professional opinion, aggressively illegal. Whoever drafted them was counting on the signatory not having access to qualified legal review. Blake told me the review was built into the process, Sienna said. The reviewer he referenced in Section 4 is a notary, not an attorney. That's either a deliberate misrepresentation or a technicality so convenient it amounts to the same thing. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November afternoon was moving toward its early dark, the sky going gray-orange through the windows of the house that had been, for a brief terrible period, the stage for something I was only now understanding the full dimensions of. We need to file today, Josephine said. Emergency injunction to freeze whatever assets remain under the instruments you've signed. If Blake surfaces, we need him served before he has time to organize. And the Meridian structure, she opened her briefcase and produced her own folder. I've been working on a parallel case involving Meridian affiliates in 2 other states. This is not their first operation. Sienna made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. Other people, she said. They did this to other people. Yes. How many? That I'm aware of? 7 inheritance cases in the past 4 years. 3 of them recovered significant portions of the stolen assets through the legal process. 2 recovered partial amounts. 2 recovered nothing because the principals couldn't be located. And Marcus Vale? Josephine looked at her steadily. Marcus Vale has used at least 4 different names in 4 different states. He is very good at what he does, but he makes the same structural mistakes every time, because people who are very good at something tend to stop questioning their method. A pause. We know his mistakes. That's an advantage. Sienna sat back in her chair. She looked exhausted, genuinely, physically exhausted, the way people look when they've been running on adrenaline for too long and the adrenaline has finally quit on them. She also looked, underneath the exhaustion, like someone who was beginning to understand the actual shape of the thing that had happened to her. Not just the financial shape, the human shape. The shape of how it had been constructed, brick by brick, starting with a woman named Portia. Showing up 5 days after a will was read and calling someone she barely knew bestie. Starting with a man named Garrett Blake, sitting down at a dining room table with a leather portfolio and a smile that was doing too much work. starting with every small, careful choice to isolate Sienna from anyone who might have asked inconvenient questions, starting specifically with me. I watched my daughter understand this. I watched it move across her face, and I felt something that I did not expect to feel right then, which was not satisfaction, not vindication, not the particular relief of having been proven right, but something closer to grief. Because understanding being manipulated and understanding having allowed it are two different realizations, and the second one costs more, and I could see it costing her. We should start on the filing, Franklin said to Josephine. Agreed, I'll need a workspace. You can use the study, Sienna said. She looked at me. Mom. Yeah. Will you stay? Tonight, I mean. While they're working. I don't. She stopped. The stripped-down quality was back in her voice, that younger and smaller sound. I don't want to be in this house alone. I thought about Diane's spare room with its cinnamon candles and Senator's orange indifference and the 17 pages of careful notes I had written at the desk by the window. I thought about the rolling suitcase in the corner that I had not fully unpacked. I thought about the gate clicking shut and the delivery truck passing twice, and the golden light doing its apologetic thing. I'll stay, I said. Not because everything was fixed, not because the words she'd said in this kitchen 3 weeks ago had been taken back, or their damage undone. Not because $11 million had reappeared and the people who had taken it were caught, and the contracts were void and the world had righted itself back to something fair. But because she was my daughter and she was scared and I was her mother, and some things are simply what they are regardless of everything else that's happened in between. Josephine Park went into the study with her briefcase. Franklin followed. The door closed. And Sienna and I sat at the kitchen table in the growing dark, and nobody said anything, and the refrigerator hummed, and eventually she got up and turned on the lights, and the kitchen became itself again. Just a kitchen, just two people in it, just the beginning of something that was going to be very, very hard. Outside, the first real cold of November settled over the estate. Inside, the work had just begun. The study light stayed on until 2 in the morning. I know because I was awake for all of it. Sienna had finally fallen asleep on the living room couch, somewhere around midnight. Not a peaceful sleep, the kind where you can see the tension still working in someone's jaw and shoulders, even when they're unconscious. And I had covered her with the throw blanket from the armchair, and then sat in the chair itself and listened to the sounds of Franklin and Josephine working in the study. The occasional murmur of voices, papers moving, Josephine's phone ringing twice, answered immediately, the conversation brief and technical. The specific silence of people doing concentrated, careful work. I had lived in this house for 4 years, and I knew its sounds. The way the heating system knocked once before it kicked on. The particular creak of the third stair. The sound the kitchen faucet made if you didn't turn it all the way off. Sitting in the dark living room with my sleeping daughter and the distant sounds of 2 attorneys trying to salvage what was left of her inheritance, I felt those familiar sounds as something close to painful. The house knew me even if its legal owner had, for a period, decided she didn't. At 2:15, the study door opened and Franklin came out quietly. He saw me in the chair and nodded, and I got up and followed him to the kitchen, where we sat across from each other at the same table that had been, over the course of this story, so many different kinds of battlefield. How bad? I asked. He had the look of a man who had organized what he needed to say before coming out of that room. The injunction was filed at 11:50. Judge Harmon is on call for financial emergencies. Josephine has worked with her before. We should have a response by morning. And if the injunction holds, then we freeze whatever remains under the instruments Sienna signed before any further transfers can be executed. There are 4 accounts referenced in the documents. 2 we're fairly certain are still intact. The transfer windows on those hadn't opened yet. 1 is partially dispersed. 1, he paused. We don't know yet. It depends on whether Blake acted before he went dark. What about the 11 million Marcus Vail took? Franklin folded his hands on the table. This was a gesture I associated with him delivering information he wished he didn't have to deliver. Recovery is possible. Josephine's parallel case in the other 2 states has already located portions of the funds moved through similar operations. Vail uses a specific set of offshore structures, sophisticated but traceable if you know the architecture. The challenge is time and jurisdiction. How much time? Months, likely. The legal process for international asset recovery is, I know what it is, I said. I worked in finance for 20 years. Right. He almost smiled. I keep forgetting that. People keep forgetting that, I said, and it came out more tired than bitter. We sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment. The heating system knocked, kicked on. Clara, Franklin said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to feel free to tell me it's none of my business. Ask. The documentation you compiled over the 3 weeks you were away, the timeline, the names, the specific conversations, it's remarkably thorough. Josephine called it the most useful pre-engagement client document she's seen in 15 years of practice. It needed to be thorough, I said. I understand that. What I'm asking is, how did you know to do it? Not the documentation itself. The phone call to me. The decision to start building a record before anything had visibly gone wrong. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I spent 20 years reading financial situations. You develop instincts about what something is pretending to be versus what it is. Garrett Blake's presentation, everything about it was calibrated for someone who didn't know what to look for. But the calibration itself was visible to someone who did. Evelyn knew that about you, Franklin said quietly. I looked at him. She talked about you, he said, in the years before she died. She said you were the most financially literate person in her family who wasn't named Evelyn Mercer. A pause. She also said she worried about what would happen to that money if Sienna ever found herself in the wrong company. The kitchen felt very still suddenly. She said that. More than once. Then why didn't she? I stopped. Because I could see the answer to the question I hadn't finished asking, and the answer was the one that was hardest to sit with. Because Evelyn Mercer, for all her precision and foresight, had been a grandmother before she was a strategist when it came to this particular subject. Because you can know something intellectually. My granddaughter may not be ready for this, and still be unable to bring yourself to act on it. When acting on it means admitting that the person you love has a weakness you helped create by loving them. She gave me your number, I said. Yes. That was deliberate. Everything Evelyn did was deliberate. I sat with that for a long moment. The particular grief of understanding someone's love in retrospect, after they are gone and can no longer be thanked for it, is its own specific weight, and I had been carrying a version of it since the funeral, and sitting in this kitchen at 2 in the morning, it settled on to me fresh. Get some sleep, I told Franklin. There's a guest room at the top of the stairs. I've got a few more hours of work. Franklin, you're 70 years old and you've been at this since noon. The injunction is filed. Get some sleep. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that reminded me, unexpectedly, of Evelyn, that particular quality of a person who is deciding whether to be amused or annoyed and lands on amused. All right, he said. A few hours. He went upstairs. I went back to the armchair. Sienna was still asleep, still tense in the jaw. I sat in the dark, and I let myself be tired, which I had not fully allowed myself to be since the gate had clicked shut 23 days ago. The injunction held. Judge Harmon issued the emergency order at 7:42 in the morning, and Josephine had the serving paperwork moving by 8. By 9, 2 of the 4 accounts referenced in the instruments were frozen. By 10, Josephine's contact at the Financial Crimes Division confirmed that the 3rd account, the partially dispersed one, still held approximately 60% of its original balance. The 4th account, the one tied most directly to Blake, was empty. When Josephine delivered this in the kitchen over coffee that I made this time properly, Sienna received the news with the stillness of someone who has already done the worst imagining and is now just calibrating reality against it. So he took it all, Sienna said. The 4th account, yes, approximately 4.3 million. On top of Marcus's 11. Yes. Sienna looked at the table. 15 million in less than 30 days. The remaining estate is protected for now, Josephine said, and the frozen accounts give us significant leverage for recovery proceedings. But the 15 million is a different, longer process. I won't tell you it's certain, because nothing in this area is certain. What I can tell you is that we have more to work with than most cases I take on. Because of the documentation, Sienna said. She glanced at me. Largely, yes. Sienna looked back at the table. Something was working in her face. Several things simultaneously, which is what faces do when they're holding more than one true feeling at once. Then she said, without looking up, Portia knew, didn't she? It wasn't a question, not really. Josephine and Franklin exchanged a look. We believe Ms. Langford's involvement was more than social, Josephine said carefully. The timing of her introduction to your life, her facilitation of the Vale connection, Certain communications we've been able to access through the legal proceedings, they suggest a coordinated role. She was part of it from the beginning, Sienna said. Still, not a question. That appears to be the case, yes. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Sienna made a sound, a short, hard exhale, and stood up from the table and went to the window, and stood there looking out at the November backyard, the bare trees and the gray sky, and the dead garden that hadn't been tended since Evelyn's gardener retired 2 years ago. I watched my daughter stand at that window and understand the full architecture of what had been done to her. Not just the money, the construction of it, the way it had been built specifically around her particular vulnerabilities. The loneliness of suddenly having more than she'd ever imagined and not knowing who to trust. The desire to feel chosen, elite, smart. The complicated, unprocessed feelings about me that someone had found and sharpened into a tool. Portia Langford had not shown up in her life and found a happy, secure person to exploit. She had found a young woman who had just lost her grandmother and inherited a fortune she didn't know how to carry, who had a mother she loved but also needed to separate from, who wanted desperately to feel like she had become herself independently. Portia had found that specific person, and she had been exactly what that specific person most wanted, a friend who saw her as powerful. It was precise, it was cruel, and it had worked. I need to ask you something, Sienna said to the window. Ask, I said. She turned around. Her eyes were dry, which surprised me, but her face had the quality of someone who has moved past the stage of crying into something harder and quieter. How long did you know? About Portia specifically. I suspected within the first week, I said. I didn't have anything concrete until Franklin made his calls. But something about the speed of her insertion into your life, the intensity, the way she spoke over me in my own kitchen without even registering it as something that required acknowledgement. She told me you didn't like her because you were threatened by her, Sienna said. I know. She said you were used to being the most important person in my life, and that you couldn't handle sharing that space. I understand why that was effective, I said. It was effective because part of me wanted to believe it. She said it without flinching, which took something. It was easier to believe you were the problem than to... She stopped. I wanted the money to be something I could handle, something I was equipped for. And you being worried felt like you saying I wasn't. So when she gave me a different explanation for your worry, you took it. I took it. We looked at each other across the kitchen. Josephine had quietly gathered her papers, and she and Franklin had both found reasons to be elsewhere, which was a kindness I registered and filed away. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, Sienna said. I know that's not how it works. And I know I can say I was manipulated, and that's true. And it's also true that I made choices. I chose to hear what she said about you. I chose to believe it. I chose to ask you to leave. Yes, I said. You did. I chose to say those things to you, in this kitchen, about you making yourself essential. Yes. She looked like each confirmation cost her something, which was probably right. I don't have an excuse for that part. No, I said. You don't. Is there... She faltered. Is there anything I can say? I thought about that question with the seriousness it deserved, which meant I didn't answer it immediately, which I could see was difficult for her, but which I wasn't willing to rush. Not today, I finally said. Not as a single thing. It's going to be actions over time. It's going to be slow. I'm not going to pretend the words you said didn't hit where they hit. And I'm not going to pretend this whole month didn't happen, because it did happen, and it's part of what I know about you now. She nodded, and the nodding had the quality of someone receiving a sentence they had been expecting and had decided to accept. But, I said, and she looked up. You called me. When it fell apart, you called me. Not Portia, not Garrett Blake, not any of the new people. You called me. Of course I called you, she said, and her voice cracked for the first time since I had arrived. You're my mother. I know, I said. That's what I'm saying. The afternoon brought developments that moved faster than I expected. Josephine had identified a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division who had been building a case against the Meridian Network for 8 months, and the emergency injunction in our state connected to existing proceedings in ways that suddenly made our situation less isolated and more powerful. By 3 in the afternoon, Garrett Blake had been located, not fled to a foreign country as I had feared, but sitting in a hotel 40 miles away, apparently under the impression that the instruments he had created were clean enough to withstand scrutiny. They were not. Josephine received the call while we were all in the study going through the remaining financial documents, and the way she received it, a small, controlled exhale and a particular quality of attention, told me it was significant before she said a word. Blake is in custody, she said. Sienna went very still. Federal agents picked him up approximately an hour ago in connection with the existing Meridian investigation. Our filing this morning contributed material evidence to a federal case that had been building toward exactly this point. Franklin said nothing. He was looking at the desk, Evelyn's desk, with an expression I couldn't fully read, but that I thought might be something like, "You see, Evelyn, it's moving." "Does that help us?" Sienna asked. "Substantially. Blake's cooperation with federal investigators, if it comes. And when people in his situation understand the alternative, cooperation tends to come, could accelerate asset recovery significantly. He knows where the money went. He knows the structures Vail used. He knows every piece of this because he built the architecture." "And Portia?" Josephine's expression shifted slightly. "Ms. Langford is a more complicated matter legally. Her role was instrumental, but designed to appear social. That creates evidentiary challenges. I won't tell you there will definitely be legal consequences for her. What I can tell you is that she will be interviewed, and that what she says in that interview will determine a great deal." "She'll lie," Sienna said flatly. "Probably. She's very good at it." "Most people who do this for a living are," Josephine said. "But most people who do this for a living also make the mistake of believing they're smarter than the process. The process is very patient." After Josephine and Franklin left that evening, with promises of morning updates and a list of things Sienna needed to gather for the next stage of proceedings, the house became very quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a day of density, where so much has happened that the air itself seems to need to settle. We ordered food. Neither of us cooked. We sat at the kitchen table with containers of Thai takeout and ate mostly in silence, the companionable kind rather than the hostile kind, which was its own form of progress. At some point, Sienna said, "She got your plants." I looked up. "Portia." Sienna was looking at the windowsill. "She took a bunch of things from the living room when she came by 2 weeks ago. Said she was helping redecorate. I let her." A pause. "Your pothos was on the windowsill. I don't know what happened to it." I looked at the empty windowsill where the pothos had been. 9 years old, 3 apartments. "It's a plant," I said. "I know. But it was yours." "It was a plant, Sienna." She was quiet for a moment. "I should have taken better care of your things. There are sentences that mean something larger than they appear to mean on the surface, and this was one of them, and we both understood it as such, and neither of us named it, which was the right choice." "I know," I said. That night, I slept in the guest room, not in my old room, which Sienna had at some point during the past 3 weeks redecorated in a way that felt decisive, and I lay in the dark and took stock of the day the way I have always taken stock at the end of hard days, going through it piece by piece. Blake in custody, the injunction holding, the 4 accounts, the frozen 3, the empty one, 11 million and 4 million, and the long, uncertain road of recovery. Josephine Park and her patient process. Franklin and his phone calls made from a lawn where a mower had gone quiet. Evelyn's desk, holding all of its papers. Sienna at the kitchen window, understanding the shape of what had been done to her. "You called me. When it fell apart, you called me." "Of course I called you. You're my mother." I had not told Sienna yet what Franklin had told me, that Evelyn had worried, had seen this coming in some version, had given me a phone number on a Saturday morning the way she gave everything, directly, without ceremony, as if it were obvious. I wasn't sure when the right time for that conversation would be. Maybe soon. Maybe it would be useful for Sienna to know that her grandmother had loved her with full awareness of her weakness, and had still found a way to leave a safeguard in place. That being loved clearly does not require being loved blindly. Or maybe I would keep that one for myself a little longer. Evelyn's last gift to me. The knowledge that someone with everything had still looked at me and thought, "This woman will know what to do." Outside, the November wind moved through the oak trees along the driveway, the same trees I had driven past 8 years ago, while Sienna scrolled her phone in the passenger seat, not looking up when I said, "Look at this place, look at it." The house settled around me, the way houses do at night, making its small sounds. I was still in it. I had walked back through the gate with my spine straight and my eyes open, and the woman who had walked back through was not the same woman who had walked out. She was harder in some places and softer in others, and she knew things she had not known before, about her daughter, and about herself, and about the difference between being needed and being loved. Both could be real, both could matter, and knowing the difference between them was not a wound. It was just wisdom, and wisdom always costs something, and you pay the cost, and you carry what you've bought, and you keep going. Tomorrow, there would be more phone calls, more documents, more of the slow and unglamorous work of recovering what had been taken. There would be conversations with Sienna that would be harder than the ones we'd had today, and there would be days when the progress felt invisible and days when it didn't. And there would be the long reckoning of two women trying to rebuild a trust that one of them had broken because she had been frightened and ambitious, and 23 days of bad company away from herself. None of that was going to be clean, but I was here. And tomorrow morning I would get up and make the coffee properly, and we would sit at the kitchen table and we would begin. The wind moved through the oaks. The house settled. I closed my eyes. Morning came the way mornings do after nights like that. Not gently, not with any particular grace, just light arriving through the curtains, whether you were ready for it or not. I was up before Sienna. I made coffee properly, the way I had promised myself I would, standing in the kitchen in the early gray of a November morning that had frost on the window panes, and the particular quality of silence that belongs to houses, where something significant has recently shifted. I made enough for two. I set 2 cups on the table, and I stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the dead garden and the bare oak trees along the driveway, and I thought, we are somewhere in the middle of this now. Not at the beginning anymore. Not yet at the end. That was not a small thing. Sienna came downstairs 40 minutes later, still in the clothes she'd slept in, hair pulled back with the pen she'd apparently found on the nightstand because it was the closest thing. And she looked so much like herself at 22, the version before the inheritance, before Portia, before all of it, that something moved through me that I did not immediately have a name for. Not grief exactly. Not relief. Something that lived between the two and was made of 30 years of knowing someone in all their forms. She saw the coffee. She sat down. She wrapped both hands around the cup the way she had done since she was 17 and thought coffee made her look adult. And she said, "Did you sleep?" "Some," I said. "Me too. Some." She looked at the table. "Josephine is coming at 10. "I know." "Franklin called me last night, after midnight. He said there's been movement on the Blake situation." I looked at her. "What kind of movement?" "He's talking." She said it quietly, with a flatness that was its own kind of emotion. "Garrett Blake is cooperating with the federal investigators. He gave them everything last night. Meridian's full structure, the offshore accounts, the names of every client they targeted in the last 4 years. Marcus Vale's real identity and his current location." A pause. "They found him in Portugal." The word landed with a particular weight between us. Portugal. The trip I had canceled when I had to redirect my savings. The trip I had promised myself someday without really believing someday. Portugal, where a man who had stolen $11 million from my daughter had apparently been sitting with his feet up, waiting for the architecture of his crime to make him untouchable. "Did they—" I started. "I was arrested at 6 in the morning, their time," Sienna said. "Josephine says the international arrest was possible because of the federal case, because Blake talked." I sat down across from her, picked up my coffee. "That's significant. She says the asset recovery timeline changes completely now. With Vale in custody and Blake cooperating, the offshore structures become traceable in ways they wouldn't have been otherwise." She looked up at me. "She said we could recover most of it. Not all, but most." I looked at my daughter across the table, at the pen in her hair and the dark circles under her eyes, and the hand still wrapped around the coffee cup. And I thought about Evelyn Mercer sitting at this same table, drinking the coffee I brought to her on Saturday mornings, talking about business and books, and the particular education that life delivers whether you enrolled for it or not. "Evelyn would have had something to say about all of this," I said. Sienna almost smiled. "She would have said she expected better from me. She would have said exactly that. And then she would have said—" Sienna stopped, thought about it. "She would have said the mistake was survivable if I learned something from it." She always separated the two, the mistake and the lesson. She said only one of them was permanent. "That sounds right," I said. We sat with that for a moment, with Evelyn between us the way she sometimes was, present without being there. the particular persistence of people who were precise enough in life that their thinking outlasts them. I've been thinking about something, Sienna said, since last night. I want to tell you, and I want you to let me finish before you respond. Okay, she set her cup down. When this is over, when the legal process runs its course and we know what we've recovered and what we haven't, I want to restructure everything, the estate management, the financial oversight, all of it. And I want to do it properly this time, with people who actually know what they're doing. She looked at me directly. I want you involved. Not because I need someone to take care of me. I need to be clear about that. I know that distinction matters to you, and it matters to me too now. But because you are the most qualified person I know, and because I wasted 3 weeks listening to people who wanted to use me instead of listening to the one person who has never, in 30 years, wanted anything from me except for me to be okay. I did not say anything immediately. I had promised her I would let her finish. I also want to say, her voice changed slightly, got quieter, that I know an apology is not a solution. I know you told me it's going to be actions over time, and I believe you. I'm not trying to shortcut that. I'm just... She stopped. I need you to know that I understand now. Not just what they did to me, what I did to you. The specific thing, with the specific words, in this kitchen, over your crossword puzzle. The crossword puzzle, I said. I keep thinking about the crossword puzzle. Why? Because it was so ordinary. You were just sitting there, being normal, being yourself. And I came in with my blazer and my prepared speech, and She pressed her lips together. I was so cruel, Clara. She rarely called me by my name. It was something she did when she needed me to hear her as a person speaking to another person, not just as a daughter speaking to a mother. The weight of it was different. I know, I said. Do you know why I wore the blazer? I assumed. Portia told me to. She said it would help me feel authoritative. She said mothers respond to... She said... Sienna stopped, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone finally hearing, out loud, the thing they had been carrying silently and understanding how it sounds. She coached me. She told me what to say and how to stand and what to wear. She had me rehearse it. The kitchen was very quiet. She rehearsed the speech with you, I said slowly. The specific words. About me making myself essential on purpose. She framed it as helping me find my own voice. Sienna's jaw was tight. She said the ideas were mine, that she was just helping me articulate them. And I believed her because I wanted to believe them, because they let me do what I wanted to do without feeling like the villain. I thought about Portia Langford and her polished wall smile and her Tuesday morning coffee, and the way she had turned slightly away from Sienna every time I walked into a room, drawing Sienna into a private orbit that was designed to have no room for me. I thought about the methodical, patient work of that, learning someone well enough to know exactly what words would unlock them, exactly what script would make them capable of things they would not otherwise have been capable of. It was, I had to admit, an almost impressive kind of cruelty, the kind that doesn't leave visible marks, the kind that makes the person doing the harm believe, genuinely believe, that they are exercising their own free will. She's very good at her work, I said. I want to say she's a monster, Sienna said. It would be easier. She probably is, somewhere underneath the talent for it. But being a monster doesn't mean the choices you made because of her were not also your choices. Both things exist. The manipulation and your response to it. I know, she said. I'm not trying to give myself an exit. Good. She looked at her hands. I need to understand how I became the kind of person who did that. Because I don't recognize her. The person who handed you a garbage bag in November. I don't recognize her. I do, I said. She looked up. She's the 10-year-old who stopped sleeping when her father left. She's the girl who needed so badly to feel like she had made herself, because the alternative was feeling like she was only the product of abandonment and other people's sacrifices and circumstances she didn't choose. She needed to be powerful. She needed to feel like the money was proof that she had arrived somewhere, that she had become someone, all on her own. I looked at her steadily, and someone found that need and used it against her. Sienna's eyes were wet now. She didn't cry, but they were wet. It's true, and it's also not an excuse, I said. You can understand why you did something and still be accountable for it. Those aren't in opposition. She nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand inelegantly, like a kid. I'm going to need a therapist. Yes, I said. You are. A good one. Do you have? I'll send you her number. Something shifted in her face. A small, involuntary thing, half relief and half something I couldn't name, and she almost laughed. You already have a name. I've been thinking about this for 3 weeks, Sienna. I have several names. This time she did laugh, brief and imperfect and genuinely hers. And that laugh, that specific sound, which I had been hearing for 30 years and had been afraid in some quiet part of myself I might not hear again, landed somewhere in my chest like the first real warmth of a very long cold. Josephine arrived at 10 as promised, with Franklin and a third person I hadn't met, a young woman named Dara, who turned out to be a forensic accountant working with Josephine on the federal case. They spread documents across Evelyn's desk and the dining room table, and proceeded to run what felt like a small but highly organized operation for the next 5 hours. I worked alongside them. This was, I will tell you, one of the more quietly satisfying experiences of the entire ordeal. Sitting at that table with my 20 years of financial background and my 17 pages of careful documentation and watching. Dara's eyes go slightly wide when she understood the depth and precision of the timeline I had built from Diane's spare room. This is, she said, scrolling through it on her laptop. This is genuinely exceptional documentation. The timestamp correlations alone. I worked in financial services for 2 decades, I said. I can tell. People keep being surprised by that. She glanced up at me and smiled. A direct, honest smile, the kind that doesn't have an agenda. They shouldn't be. No, they shouldn't. By 3 in the afternoon, the picture was clearer than it had been at any point since this began. Blake's cooperation had unlocked the offshore structure in a way that gave federal investigators direct access to the account trails. Of the $15 million between Vale and Blake, approximately $11.2 million was traceable and frozen pending recovery proceedings. The remaining $3.8 million had moved through enough layers that recovery was possible but would take significantly longer. The 3 accounts frozen by the morning injunction, representing the bulk of the remaining estate, approximately $29 million after various legitimate transactions, were intact and secured. Josephine's filing had caught them before the transfer windows on 2 of them opened, which had been, as she put it with characteristic understatement, a fortunate matter of timing. It was not fortune. It was Franklin's phone calls and my 17 pages and Evelyn's phone number given on a Saturday morning, like it was obvious. But I let the understatement stand. At some point in the late afternoon, while Josephine and Dara were working through the final document review, Sienna came to find me. I was in the kitchen making more coffee, the 3rd pot of the day, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, and I thought, I wonder how many times in the next year she will stand in doorways like that, recalibrating the space between us before she enters it. I thought, that's okay. We can do slow. Slow is how things that last are built. There's something I haven't told you, she said. I looked at her. Okay. When Portia left, the morning after Blake disappeared, when she said she had an appointment and just went, I called her that night. I asked her directly if she had known about any of this. What did she say? She said I was being paranoid. She said I was looking for someone to blame because I'd made bad financial decisions, and I was embarrassed. She said, Sienna's voice was level, but the levelness was costing her. She said I was acting exactly like my mother, clingy and suspicious and unable to trust. The coffee maker finished its cycle. The sound of it was very ordinary against the weight of what she had just said. And? I said, and I almost believed her. Again. She met my eyes. That's what I needed to tell you, that even then, even with everything collapsing, there was a part of me that almost chose her version of events over the obvious reality. Because her version was familiar by that point. She'd built it so carefully that it had its own gravity. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know how close it came. You deserve to know that it wasn't simple. It wasn't me waking up and immediately seeing clearly. It was me standing at the edge of choosing wrong again and pulling back. I poured the coffee, set a cup in front of her. What made you pull back? She was quiet for a moment. I thought about what you said when you left, on the doorstep, about people who care about you not needing you to be alone to work their way in, about that not being love but strategy. She wrapped her hands around the cup, and I thought, you said that when you were leaving, with your suitcase. When I had hurt you as badly as I had ever hurt anyone, you still said something true. You still said something that was for me, not against her. And I thought, that's not a person who made herself essential on purpose. That's just a person who loves me. I did not say anything. There are moments that don't need words added to them, and this was one. I just stood there in the kitchen of a house that had held a month of the most difficult things I had ever lived through. And I looked at my daughter, and I let what she had said be exactly what it was. We drank our coffee. The afternoon moved toward its early dark. Josephine and Franklin and Dara packed up their documents and said their goodbyes with the restrained warmth of professionals who have been through something genuinely hard alongside people and know that the restraint is a form of respect. Franklin shook Sienna's hand and then, unexpectedly, held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and looked at her with an expression that I recognized from the way Evelyn used to look at things she was trying to commit to memory. Your grandmother, he said, was very proud of you, before any of this. She told me many times. Sienna blinked. Even though the pride wasn't conditional on the outcome of every decision, he said gently. It was based on who she believed you were. She had good judgment about people. He let go of her hand. He nodded at me. And then they were gone, and the house was quiet again, and Sienna stood in the hallway for a long moment with her hand slightly raised, as if she could still feel the warmth of that. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. I want to be very clear about that, because transformation is a word that gets applied to recoveries like ours in ways that sand off all the rough edges and make it seem cleaner than it was. What actually happened was slower and less satisfying and more real than any version of transformation. We worked. Every day there was something to work on, documents to review, proceedings to track, decisions to make, about the estate structure that Sienna had promised to build properly this time. I came to the house 3 days a week, not living there. That was a line I was not ready to cross, and Sienna had not asked me to, which told me she was paying attention. I had my own space at Diane's, and then in January, an apartment 2 miles away that I furnished slowly and made mine deliberately, choosing each thing with the intention of a woman who understood that home was something you built yourself, not something that happened to you. Sienna started therapy in December. The therapist was Dr. Renata Cole. I had given her 3 names, and she had chosen the one I hadn't specifically recommended, which felt healthy. She didn't tell me what they talked about, and I didn't ask, and that was also healthy. There were hard days. Days when the legal process stalled, and the frustration of waiting for institutions to move at their own pace felt like its own kind of theft. Days when Sienna and I said something to each other that landed wrong, that pulled at the scar tissue of October. And we had to navigate that carefully, and sometimes badly, and then try again. Days when I drove home from the estate and sat in my car in the parking lot of my new apartment building and felt the full weight of everything that had happened in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel it at the time because there wasn't room for it at the time. I cried in my car in that parking lot on 3 separate occasions. I want to include that because I think it matters. Because the story I'm telling you is not one where surviving something means not being damaged by it. I was damaged by it. I am still, in places, carrying the damage. The words Sienna said in that kitchen about making myself essential on purpose, those words did not disappear because they turned out to have been coached. They still found something in me that was uncertain, that wondered, that asked itself in the dark. Was there something true in it? Was I impossible to separate from? Was the love too much? I don't have a clean answer to that. I've made my peace with not having one. What I know is this: I was there, and she needed someone who was there, and I was the right person for the moment, even if I was a complicated person for other moments. Both things. Both. In February, 8 months after Garrett Blake walked into Sienna's dining room with his leather portfolio and his smile that was working too hard, the federal court issued the first recovery order. Approximately $9 million was returned to Sienna's estate accounts from the frozen Meridian assets. The remaining $2.2 million remained in recovery proceedings that would, Josephine estimated, resolve by the end of the year. Garrett Blake pled guilty to 3 counts of securities fraud and 2 counts of wire fraud and received a sentence that was, in Josephine's measured assessment, appropriate. Marcus Vale, his real name turned out to be David Kern, 44 years old, originally from Ohio, was extradited from Portugal and faced federal charges in 3 states simultaneously. His trial was pending. Portia Langford was interviewed by federal investigators twice. She maintained, with the consistency of someone who has rehearsed something very thoroughly, that she had no knowledge of the fraudulent nature of any of the transactions and was herself a victim of Marcus Vale's deception. There was insufficient evidence to charge her. She walked. I will tell you the truth. That was the part that cost me the most. Not the money. The money was numbers, and numbers can be rebuilt. Portia walking out of a federal building in her good coat and going back to her life, looking for the next Sienna, the next inheritance, the next lonely young woman who needed someone to make her feel chosen. That sat in me like something unfinished. Sienna said, when I told her, she'll do it again. Probably, I said, and we can't stop her. No. So what do we do with that? I thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. We make sure the people we love know how to recognize it, I said. We talk about it. We don't pretend it doesn't happen because it's uncomfortable. We tell the truth about how it works, how it starts small and flattering and then slowly, methodically, moves the furniture 3 inches at a time until everything feels wrong and you can't identify why. Sienna was quiet for a moment. Is that why you're telling this story? Yes, I said. That's exactly why. Because here is what I know, at the other side of all of it. Wealth does not protect you. Wealth, in certain hands, at certain moments, becomes the very thing that makes you vulnerable, because it attracts precisely the people who are most skilled at finding the gap between what you have and what you fear you don't deserve. And those people do not look like predators. They look like opportunities. They look like the life you imagined, finally arriving. That's the thing nobody tells you. The danger doesn't announce itself. And the people who love you, the ones who were there before the money, before the moment, before the shine of all that new possibility, those people will sometimes look, by comparison, like obstacles, like the past clinging to the present, like something you need to outgrow in order to arrive. That is the lie. That is exactly the lie. And it is the most expensive lie I have ever seen anyone buy. I moved fully into my apartment in March. I have a kitchen with good light and a window above the sink that faces east. And in the spring, the mornings through that window are something I look forward to. The way I have not looked forward to mornings in a long time. I have a new pothos on the windowsill. I bought it in February, a small one with 3 leaves, and by March it was already reaching toward the glass. Things that want to live will find the light. That's just what they do. Sienna came to see the apartment on a Saturday in April, the first warm Saturday of the year, and she brought coffee from the good place downtown. She had learned my order without asking, which is the kind of thing that doesn't happen by accident. And we sat at my kitchen table, just the 2 of us, and we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, about the legal proceedings and the spring and a trip she was thinking about taking, somewhere she'd never been, about Randolph, a little, and Evelyn, a lot.
At some point she looked at the pothos on the windowsill and she said, "It's doing well." "It's getting there," I said. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking at it. Then she looked at me. "Are we?" I thought about that honestly. "We're getting there," I said. "We're not there, but we're moving in the right direction." "That's enough," she said. "Yes," I said. "It is." Outside, April was doing what April does, indifferent to everything that had happened in the months before it, offering its light without conditions or history, or any awareness of what it cost to get to a morning where the window faces east and the coffee is right, and the person across the table is someone you are still, carefully, learning how to trust again. That's the end of the story. Not the clean end, not the version where everything is recovered and everyone has learned their lesson and the sun comes out and stays out, but the true end, which is this: 2 women at a kitchen table in April with good coffee and a small plant on the windowsill and the long, imperfect, necessary work of finding their way back to each other still ahead of them. It's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything that money could never buy and everything that it very nearly cost us. And I will not forget that, not any of it, not the crossword puzzle, not the gate, not the garbage bag of winter coats, not the pothos that someone took. I will not forget it, because forgetting it would mean losing the most important thing this whole brutal year gave me: the knowledge that I am a woman who does not break, who documents and waits and moves carefully and stays, who walks back through gates that were closed against her when someone she loves needs her to, not because she made herself essential, because she is.